Forget China. The real geopolitical shock? Donald Trump may have just lit the fuse on a resource war with Canada. That's right, America's closest ally, the Maple Leaf Nation itself, is suddenly in Washington's crosshairs. And it's not over ideology, military threats, or even politics, it's over something far more primal: resources. The president isn't just talking tough, he's ripping up decades-old agreements, slapping tariffs like it's a trade war on steroids, and dragging Canada into a conflict no one saw coming. What was once unthinkable, the US treating Canada like an adversary, might just be the new normal. So what happened to the legendary US-Canada bromance? Why is Trump treating the true North like public enemy number one? And what could a full-blown resource war actually look like? Let's break it down. It's no secret that Canada is a veritable goldmine of resources. It's a colossal landmass, the second biggest in the world, extending across more than 3.8 million square miles of land. Approximately 39% of that gigantic landmass is forest. That's around 367 million hectares of forest, almost 10% of the entire globe's forest area, providing an extraordinarily large supply of wood for construction, manufacture, fuel, and other uses. Canada is also rich in minerals. It's the world's #1 producer of potash, which is an important ingredient in making fertilizer, and also ranks highly in uranium, copper, nickel, cobalt, gold, silver, iron, and even diamonds. It has the third largest oil reserves in the world, ranking as the fourth biggest oil producer and exporter after the US, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. But perhaps the most important and valuable of all Canada's many resources is also one of the simplest: water. There are around 2 million lakes in Canada, giving the country one of the biggest renewable supplies of fresh water of any nation on the planet. To be precise, around 20% of the world's surface freshwater is in Canada, and a large part of that resides in the Great Lakes, several of which are shared across the border between Canada and the US, namely Lakes Superior, Huron, Erie, and Ontario. For decades, important agreements have existed between the two countries about how to share and manage that massive supply of water. Those agreements include the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement, which was first signed back in 1972 and has undergone serious updates over the years. Its purpose is to commit both Canada and the US to restore and maintain the chemical, physical, and biological integrity of the waters of the Great Lakes. There is also the Boundary Waters Treaty, signed more than a century ago in 1909 and designed to limit any disputes over shared bodies of water between Canada and the US. And the Great Lakes Compact is an important interstate compact between the 8 US states that contain parts of the Great Lakes, namely Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. The compact serves to regulate how the waters of the Great Lakes Basin are used, with the aim being to manage the waters in a sustainable, responsible fashion and preserve them for future generations. But should Trump decide to take his plans all the way, then all 3 of those agreements might be broken. This was revealed in a New York Times article. The article detailed several phone calls between Trump and former Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in February of this year. During those calls, it's reported that Trump revealed a list of complaints he had regarding the trade relationship between Canada and the US. Notably, he aired his frustrations about Canada's protected dairy sector, Canada's consumption taxes, and challenges that US banks face when trying to operate in Canada. Trump then went on to say that he planned to revise the boundary separating the two nations and that he wished to revise the agreement about water sharing between the two countries. That issue came up again in a later call between Howard Lutnick, the US Secretary of Commerce, and Dominic LeBlanc, the Canadian Finance Minister. In that call, Lutnick told LeBlanc that Trump wanted to abandon multiple treaties and agreements between the two countries, including those that control the maintenance, management, and sharing of the Great Lake waters. The response to this threat on both sides of the border has generally been one of fear, concern, and confusion. Liz Kirkwood, the executive director of the nonprofit organization For Love of Water, or FLOW, explained that the agreements between the two countries represent a global model to protect and steward 20% of the planet's fresh surface water, adding that any break or disruption to those agreements would be bad for the health of our lakes and our communities and ultimately destructive of the US relationship with a trusted neighbor. Joel Brameyer, CEO of the Alliance for the Great Lakes, echoed those statements, saying, US treaties and agreements with Canada and similar agreements among the states and provinces are the bedrock on which sustainable protection and restoration of our Great Lakes is built. There is no space for the US to step back from its shared obligation. Cheryl Nen of Milwaukee Riverkeeper, another environmental organization, stated simply, "We should not play politics with the Great Lakes. We need to protect them from abuse and overconsumption, and that should supersede all politics." Clearly, many experts are rightfully concerned about the situation, and with good reason. Maud Barlow, author, water advocate, and former water advisor to the United Nations, explains that if Trump did decide to tear up those agreements, he could then just cancel the compact on the American side and start diverting Great Lakes water around the country to service the manufacturing and technology resurgence he's planning. In this case, there will be little Canada could do. It would be an unprecedented situation in which some of the most important and vast bodies of fresh water on the planet are no longer protected by treaties and agreements, a situation in which the US could very well siphon away water from the Great Lakes to use as it sees fit, without any regard for sustainable management or collaboration with Canada. There is no doubt that such an act would worsen the already fractured relationship between the two countries and could escalate what has, up to now, been a tariff and trade war into a much greater conflict for resources and even territory. While Barlow admits that Canada couldn't do much to stop Trump, she says that Canadians would fight to protect what's theirs, predicting fierce reactions from Canadians of all stripes, even people not particularly interested in politics. She added, "People on the street, be they on the left or right politically, don't want our water sold for export." In other words, if Trump went ahead with this move, Canadians are unlikely to simply stand by and watch it happen. The Canadian government would inevitably retaliate, and it would likely have the backing of a large part of the populace. Even people who usually care little about politics would most likely have a strong opinion about another nation coming in and using up their resources in such a bold and brash way. Daniel McFarlane, Associate Professor of Environmental and Sustainability Studies at Western Michigan University, agrees, stating, "The history of Canada and US relations around water has sort of worked on an honor system, where you actually lived up to what you said and to the letter of the agreements. But if you've got a leader who doesn't do that, then there's a whole lot of problems that can arise." So why does Trump want all of this? Why would he risk a whole lot of problems by tearing up the Great Lakes agreements and kicking off a war with Canada over resources? Well, we can't be entirely sure of the reasoning behind his intentions, but we can make some educated guesses. Water, as we mentioned earlier on, is an exceptionally important resource. Canada has huge amounts of it, and America arguably needs more. The most blatant example of this is the mega drought that's been impacting America's southwest states in recent years. Scientists say that certain parts of the Southwest have seen average annual temperatures rise by more than 2 degrees Fahrenheit. The region has been enduring its driest spell in around 1,200 years, and this has resulted in some devastating effects, like the massive Southern California wildfires in January 2025, which killed 29 people, forced more than 200,000 more people to evacuate, and destroyed thousands of homes and buildings, with fires raging across more than 89 square miles of land total. It's one of the worst water crises the US has faced in modern times, and it's likely to get worse. But let's say America could simply take all the water it wants from the Great Lakes or other parts of Canada and feed it to the Southwest. Theoretically, at least in that area, many of the negative effects of the drought would be no more, and Trump could look like a hero. Indeed, the 47th president expressed that very idea back in 2024, back on the campaign trail, before he had been elected. He was speaking in California and asked about what he might do to help solve the state's water troubles. Trump responded by claiming that there was a large faucet in Canada, British Columbia to be precise, that guided water from Canadian snowcaps into the Pacific Ocean. According to Trump, Canada could simply turn that faucet on to instead transport the water to California and solve the drought instantaneously. Canadian experts and engineers dismissed the claims. Alan Pietranero, professor of civil engineering at the University of Calgary, responded bluntly, "There's no giant faucets here. I don't really understand what he's saying." However, regardless of how true or false Trump's claims were, it's clear that he's been thinking about water for quite a while, and he clearly sees Canada as the ideal source to solve his country's water woes. Perhaps this, in part, is what fueled his recent reproaches of Canada. Starting in December 2024, Trump has repeatedly brought up the idea of annexing Canada and turning it into the 51st state of the US. He began referring to former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau as Governor Justin Trudeau of the great state of Canada, and made numerous posts on his social media site Truth Social advocating for Canada to become the 51st state. These comments were initially seen by many as some sort of joke or outlandish claim without much root in reality, but Trump has doubled down. During a press conference at Mar-a-Lago on January 7th, the president-elect stated that the US would expand its territory during his time in office. He claimed that while he had ruled out using military force to annex Canada, he planned to use economic force to pressure the country into joining the US. Then the tariffs began. The plan for 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico had first been floated back in late November, but on February 1st, less than 2 weeks after the inauguration, Trump signed an executive order to officially implement them. Canada hit back the same day with tariffs of its own, officially kicking off a trade war between the two countries that had long been the best of friends and the closest of allies. Trump then temporarily suspended the tariffs after calls with Justin Trudeau, but has since gone on to impose and increase them. He has implemented tariffs on foreign-made vehicles, auto components, steel, and aluminium, with additional plans regarding dairy products and lumber too. Canada has been reciprocating, and the impact of all of this on relations between the two countries has been significant. Surveys report that nearly 70% of Canadians now think less of the US. Flight bookings between the two countries have dropped by 70%, and large parts of the Canadian population have organized boycotts of US products, with some stores removing American products from their shelves entirely and shining the spotlight on Made in Canada goods instead. In short, there's a lot of burgeoning resentment among Canadian people and businesses, not just the government, towards Trump and the US as a whole. However, even with all these tariffs and frustrations on both sides of the border, trade between Canada and the US is not simply going to stop. The countries' economies are enormously dependent on one another. The US is Canada's biggest trading partner, with around 75% of all Canadian exports going to America. Around 62% of all Canada's imports also come from the US, so both countries buy and sell a lot between themselves. Indeed, estimates suggest that around $3.6 billion worth of goods and services cross the US-Canada border daily. Around 8 million American jobs are tied to trade with Canada, and Canada is a big supplier of energy to several US states, such as Michigan and New York. The two countries need each other in more ways than one, but with tariffs increasing and the threat of further action on the US side, the ties that bind Canada and America are certainly starting to fray. The newly appointed Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, has definitively stated that the old relationship between the US and Canada, based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation, is over. So what could happen next? While for the time being this is all purely speculation, Trump has not officially torn up any of the Great Lakes agreements, despite seeming to have such ideas in mind. He may choose not to follow through on those ideas. However, in only a few short months, the president has proven that he is willing to take drastic actions and dramatically shift US foreign policy to suit his particular plans and intentions. We cannot therefore assume that he wouldn't decide to go ahead with the Great Lakes changes. Should he do that, the consequences could be enormous. There is already a lot of tension between Canada and the US at this stage, and it would certainly boil over if the US suddenly started siphoning off Great Lakes water to places like California without Canada having any say in the matter. It's worth noting too what an ecological disaster it could be if the US abandoned its agreements to manage the Great Lakes sustainably and responsibly. If it went ahead with the move, then some of the largest freshwater lakes on the planet could rapidly degrade in quality. Gail Krantzberg, Professor of Engineering and Public Policy at McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, Canada, explains, "If Trump decides he's going to cut all funding for wastewater infrastructure, we're going to get, for example, raw sewage going into Lake Erie, and Lake Erie is going to be a mess again. And then if Trump decides that the Army Corps of Engineers is no longer going to operate the dam that stops Asian carp from coming into Chicago, and Asian carp coming into the Great Lakes through Chicago, then all bets are off for our sports fishery, which is a multi-billion-dollar-a-year industry. And if he cuts enough that pollution is enhanced, it will affect all the lakes." And who's to say that Trump would stop there? He has, after all, spoken about expanding America's territory during his second term. This might be a reference to his plans to take over Greenland, which he has openly discussed on numerous occasions. Or he might instead have plans to rewrite the US-Canada border and claim Canadian territory as his own. Plus, the 51st state talk doesn't seem to be disappearing, despite numerous Canadian politicians of several parties saying that Canada will never be part of the US. Trump may choose to keep on pushing with tariffs and other economic punishments against America's neighbors. For now, Canada seems to be coping, and Mark Carney says that the country will need to fundamentally reimagine our economy and strengthen ties with places like the European Union and the United Kingdom. However, given how heavily Canada relies on the US and how fervent President Trump has been with his tariffs and other economic measures, the pressure may eventually become too big for Canada to bear, and that could be exactly what Trump has wanted all along. Should Canada eventually buckle, and should Trump persist with his plans to wrestle control of the Great Lakes waters, there's no telling how far the situation might escalate. And while the idea of Canada as the 51st state has been dismissed by many as a fantasy, recent history has proven that events that are often called impossible can and do happen. With Canada being so rich in resources and the American economy sure to benefit if it gained control of even some of those resources, Trump may decide that it's worth tearing up decades-old agreements and perhaps wrecking one of the US's most important international relationships to get them. He may argue that the end justifies the means and that the positive potential impacts on America's economy, industries, and global power could outweigh any of the negative effects. One thing is clear: this story is far from over. The tariffs aren't going away, tensions continue to rise by the day, and the situation is likely to become much more dramatic rather than calming down anytime soon. And on both sides of the border, Americans and Canadians, people who have long considered one another friends and partners, will wait and watch to see how this extraordinary situation evolves.